Welcome everyone to this afternoon session of the Levelling Up Housing and Communities Select Committee. This afternoon we're looking at the issues of building safety, funding and remediation. This follows the Secretary of State's announcement to the House a couple of weeks ago about certain changes he was proposing and looking at those changes, the proposals and how they might develop. Just before we come over to our three witnesses, and we've got two panels of three witnesses this afternoon, I'll ask members of the committee to put on record interest they may have that may be relevant to this inquiry. I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association. I'll just go around the table. Ian Byrne.
I employ a councillor.
Ron Blackman.
I'm a Vice President of the LGA and I employ a councillor in my office.
Andrew Lowe.
Yeah, I'm the Vice President of the LGA and the National Residential Landlords Association, which is appearing on the second panel, provides the secretariat for the all-party parliamentary group for the private rented sector, which I chair.
Okay, thank you, and we'll have some other colleagues I think will be joining us, but I understand there's something of interest been happening in the chamber today which may have delayed some of them. They will join us in due course. So come over to our three witnesses. Thank you very much for attending, and I'll just go down the ones, the order I have before me. David O'Leary.
David O'Leary, I'm the Policy Director at the Home Builders Federation.
Peter Cablehorn, who's on Zoom for us today. Peter.
Good afternoon, thank you, Chair. So I'm Peter Cablehorn, I'm the Chief Executive of the Construction Products Association.
Right. And John Mulliran, is that?
John Mulrine.
Mulliran. So yeah. I do apologise, you put me right straight away.
I'm the Managing Director of the Ballymore Group, we're a developer.
Right, and you're all very welcome this afternoon. Thank you for coming. Particularly thank you to the three witnesses who have come this afternoon for some reason which they, in due course, might wish to explain. I couldn't possibly speculate. We did invite representatives from Barratt's, Taylor Wimpey and Persimmon to come, but they had other engagements, all their executives this afternoon. But the three of you, thank you very much for joining us. That's appreciated. So I mentioned at the beginning that we're particularly looking at the announcements by the Secretary of State on the 10th of January. Could you just tell us what your assessment is in general terms of those announcements, and particularly who should be responsible for paying for the remediation of the historic defects of buildings? I'll go down the order that I introduce people. David O'Leary first.
I think, thank you. On a headline level, we welcome the renewed attention that the government has placed on this subject. It's something we've been trying to encourage government for some time now to grip, and we've been offering to work with them on that. I think for a bit of additional context, from an industry perspective, we worked very closely with the government through a series of roundtables and other engagement in the immediate weeks and months after the Grenfell Tower fire. And that culminated in about 2018 with us proposing a new industry levy effectively, because I think we recognised from the outset that we had a part to play in the solution that we all need. I think we definitely also accept that leaseholders should not pay for the remediation of buildings where the building regulations have not been met. Our members, we think of totalling about £1 billion have made provisions already to remediate buildings that they had some involvement with. And in addition to that, we supported the government's efforts to bring forward the residential property developer tax, which comes in this year, was consulted on extensively and very quickly with the Treasury last year. Beyond that, I think it's still very early to say about we're engaged in this process. We've had a lot of intensive dialogue with the government through the department over the past couple of weeks. Really, I think we're at the stage of assimilating our information and trying to match it with what information the government has. I think we're still very unsighted on how many buildings do need remediation, even after all of this time, where they are, who built them. So I think for the time being, we're kind of very much at the outset of a process that I think we wish we'd have started some time ago.
Just follow up before I come on to the other witnesses. What you said so far is what's already known, that you recognise the government's announcements about tax and levy, which were there before the 10th of January, but you're not at this stage committing your members to anything in addition as a result of the 10th of January statement.
I think we need to establish over the next few weeks how much the government is actually looking for. The 4 billion figure we've heard, I don't think we can get close to that with the information that our members have, and I think that...
You don't think the figure's right then?
I think we would like to interrogate that figure a bit more, and I think the conversation needs to be wider than just developers, which is what was announced on the 10th of January.
Okay, let's just come on then and say to Peter Cablehorn, you're one of the others who isn't a developer and representing product manufacturers. Do you think you should be included in this conversation and making your contribution as well?
Thank you, Chair. I do think we should be involved in the conversation, and I do think that I support a lot of what David has just said. I think it's very important that leaseholders and occupiers do not pay for any remediation that's needed. But I do think that we need a proportionate response, and I do think that we need to interrogate exactly the level of fire safety critical issues that have been seen across a number of buildings. But we also see that perhaps there needs to be a much more proportionate approach, a better analysis of buildings and exactly what is wrong with them. I do think that we need to enter a bit more into the conversation with government, although we've been all the way through supporting the need for industry to reform, and we've been part of a number of initiatives, and we feel that those initiatives will help with the industry in the future, and in particular Code for Construction Product Information. We're very pleased that it is on the eve of launching that will help with product information, but that's very much going forward. Looking back, there are obviously a lot of problems that need to be resolved, and we're certainly happy to play our part to look at how we do that in conjunction with government. Similarly, we've been involved intensively for a couple of weeks in this situation, and we want to take things forward to identify precisely how we can help. And probably a final point, if I may, Chair, whilst we are the Construction Products Association, we do not represent everybody in the sector, and there's some particular absent companies from our membership who are critical to the issues going forward. And finally,
can you tell us who they are?
They've been particularly highlighted in the Grenfell inquiry. So the makers of the ACM and some of the other materials used within the Grenfell inquiry, or highlighted, within the Grenfell inquiry.
Okay, so that's Kingspan and others.
That Kingspan are a member, to be quite precise, but others, as I say, are not.
Well, perhaps you could let us have a note then telling us who the others are. Yeah.
Be delighted. Yes.
Okay, fine. Just moving on to leave you out, John. So it's been said quite reasonably that where developers are responsible for a building which has got defects, they should be responsible for putting it right. But there's many cases where the developer doesn't exist anymore, for whatever reason. So should the rest of the industry, like your firm, contribute to put right those mistakes?
Yeah, well, I fully agree. I think, where there are building defects, the developer has to go back and repair those defects as we do. I think, listen, if a developer fails or is not there anymore, I think ultimately the most important thing is that leaseholders aren't held accountable and don't have to pay. So I think it is appropriate that government step in, and that at that point they would levy the industry to recover those costs. So yes, I do think it's appropriate.
So you think the government should levy it rather than asking for voluntary contributions?
Well, I think the mechanism of where the contributions come from, I think, would need to come out. But I think the principle of a levy or contribution, I think, is right.
Okay, just finally, from the three of you, very, very briefly, we've talked about developers, we've talked about the product manufacturers. Is there any other section of the wider building industry that should be making a contribution to solve this problem? Yes, please, Peter, you're nodding.
Clive, thank you. I would say I think there needs to be a conversation with the whole supply chain, because clearly, buildings are constructed by a wide range, installers, contractors, subcontractors. So I think if we are going to look at solving this problem, we need actually to have everybody in the conversation.
Okay, any other contributions there?
Yeah, I'd echo some of that. I'd say that, I think what we're noticing as well is that there are a large number of buildings that have been renovated, and largely those those renovation projects aren't being done by the types of house builders that the government has targeted with its kind of engagement so far. Obviously, the government's focus so far has been around largely national home builders. So we haven't really got any insight into how many of these buildings have been built by overseas developers, and also with contractors through renovation projects. So I think as I think goes back to the starting point really, we're still waiting for some information on all of this.
Okay, well, obviously one of the issues is about the scale and impact of remediation. Bob Lemon.
Yes, thank you. If I can follow on from that, David. Obviously, the government said, and I quote, that they expect developers to fund and undertake all necessary remediation of buildings above 11 metres that they played a role in developing. So can we be clear from the industry's perspective how many buildings that is from your view?
We can't be clear right now because...
we have a problem here that there are people out there who are living in what they consider to be unsafe buildings. Every time we ask the question of different witnesses and government ministers or officials, we seem to get a different answer. Well, it can't be beyond the wit of man or beast to say how many buildings there are above 11 metres that need some work doing, surely.
No, I think individual developers have their own pictures emerging and have been busy over the past several years trying to establish that. Some of it has been as a result of proactive investigation, and some of it has been a result of building owners coming back to them and pointing out issues, which has then necessitated further exploration work. So I think individual developers have that. What they don't have is a clear picture from government of what the size of the orphan building.
So from your perspective, as we sit here today, what's your estimate of the number of buildings involved?
We don't have a cast iron estimate, I'm afraid. We are undertaking some work with the department we have been undertaking some work with the department in the last week and over the course of this week to try and establish and assimilate all of the information that we have, because that's not something.
So when do you expect that information to be ready?
I think the department is targeting sometime this week.
Good. So can we have a copy of the details from your perspective to aid us in our inquiry? Because the next question I'm coming to is, what's your estimate of the cost to the industry of doing all this work?
Again, I think we don't have a clear estimate yet of the cost, because each individual builder will have an estimate of their own provision, and some of that has been publicly announced via trading updates and so on. But collectively, what we're relying on at the moment is the government's estimate. That seems quite high to many of our members who have got sight of the buildings that they've been involved with. But that may be because there are many, many, many buildings that are now where there is no longer a developer, and they were built by overseas developers or whatever.
But there is this issue about the split between replacing unsafe cladding and remediating buildings with fire safety defects and other defects. So have we got any idea of the split between the amounts of money involved and the numbers of buildings?
All I would say, I think my understanding of the government's figure is that encompasses all building safety, fire safety related issues.
Right.
And so that's where we're working back from, and that will be informed by the new guidance that replaces the Consolidated advice note that's now been withdrawn. So as Peter says, we're trying to move to a more proportionate approach where we're judging these buildings on actual risk and more.
Yes, I mean obviously we've seen Dame Judith Hackett and Sir Ken Knight, and the proportionate risk is clear. But I mean, one of the problems we've had as a committee is to establish exactly the baseline figures. Sounds like the government is finding, and you are finding it difficult as well.
Yes, and I think we had these challenges when we were discussing the residential property developer tax.
Yep.
Less than a year ago, that conversation started, and the industry was then asked for £2 billion over 10 years. We think the number that's going to come out to is probably more like £3 billion over 10 years. But nevertheless, we were trying to interrogate the number then. And
this committee looked at things. I think I'm right in saying that we estimated 15 billion originally for the total costs. So we have a very different sort of variation in estimates here. It would be very helpful when you've got the data, if you can pass that data to us, because we will be seeing ministers in the coming days to ask them appropriate questions about the data. John, can I just turn to you? How many buildings did your company build that now need to be remediated?
Well, I mean, in terms of buildings, there's 20 buildings that we're currently looking at remedial works on. To put that in numbers...
So to be clear, you've got 20 buildings that you're looking at, and how many need to be remediated, and what's the cost involved in doing that?
So in terms of there's 20 buildings that will require some level of remedial works. Some of that we've started work on all of those. One of the things I would point out, the significance of the withdrawal of the advice notes, I think, is actually quite fundamental. That's something.
Has that caused any delay in doing the buildings?
Well, I think
cost you any extra money?
There is a possibility it could cause a delay in the commencement of some of the works. But I think the reality is it could also accelerate the completion of the works. Because, for example, we've started work on all of our buildings, but the scope of the works on some of these buildings will materially change on the back of the withdrawal of those advice notes. So we only got obviously the letter on the 10th of January. We're doing a lot of work at the moment to review what impact that's having, speaking to fire engineers and other professionals. But I think that could have a significant impact. And I think certainly, I can only speak for our portfolio, we don't have insight into the wider industry. But certainly within our portfolio, it could be very significant.
So what estimate have you made of the costs of doing all this for your company?
Well, given the range of change that this withdrawal of the advice notes could have, I slightly worry that I could mislead the committee if I give you a precise number, because it could be significantly different from where we were.
So when do you expect to be in a position to settle that?
I'd say a few weeks.
Sorry?
A few weeks, I would say. Because
okay. So could you pass us a note when you're in the position to give that
Yeah, very happy to, yeah, absolutely.
And can you give us assurance you're not passing any of these costs on to leaseholders?
No, we gave reassurance to all of our leaseholders. I think it was around a year ago that they wouldn't be making a contribution to the remedial works. So
that's both on cladding, fire safety, and any other defects.
Cladding, fire safety, and any interim measures. So all wake and watch we've covered ourselves. Installation of fire alarms we've covered ourselves. Okay. So they haven't made any contribution to any of that.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming and giving us that information. For Peter. Obviously, there's not only the buildings that have been developed, the industry is being asked to contribute overall, because obviously there may be companies that have got out of business, there may be all sorts of other problems, not only unsafe buildings that between 11 and 18 metres, but obviously the really tall buildings. Are we clear what remediation will be covered by this fund?
Not entirely, I think, is the honest answer, because when we look at the range of defects, look at a range of materials, I think we need to have a little bit more definition of what we're talking about. And again, just harping back to the thread of the conversation just now, we are concerned that we don't miss making sure that other elements of buildings that are deemed unsafe, not just cladding, need to be accounted for. At the moment, the conversation is just around cladding. So we need to actually drill into a bit more detail, and again, getting more information from buildings that have been highlighted as dangerous, and then analysing that correctly and making sure we have a clear definition of where we go is a crucial part of the exercise going forward.
So have you made any estimate of what the cost to the industry could be from your members' perspective?
We haven't as yet, because that's quite difficult without getting some of the other fundamental numbers together. Okay. But as soon as we do, we will obviously be putting that together.
Okay. Well, once again, we would appreciate seeing the information when you're able to supply it. Okay.
Of course.
Right. Thanks, Bob. Obviously, for people trapped in these potentially unsafe buildings, speed is of the essence to explore that particular problem. Ian Byrne.
Thanks, Chair. And this first part to David. How quickly will developers be able to proceed with remediation of their own buildings?
I think some remediation has already happened or is underway. As John says, some of that has been slowed down probably by the presence of the advice, the Consolidated advice note, and that has now been moved aside. I think so. You know, we're in a better position to understand what works will be required now. And working with government, we hope that that will become even clearer over the next few weeks. There is a lack of qualified professionals, and there are supply chain issues, but as quickly as possible, I would expect members to be underway with that work, notwithstanding the fact that we're very short of fire risk assessors and other qualified professionals that we're relying on, as well as contractors and other.
So we're still none the wiser, aren't we? You know, somebody that's been trapped in the building since 2017 watching this will be saying, well, we're none the wiser, really, are we, about how quickly developers can actually proceed?
I think we're closer to en masse those buildings being able to be remediated than we were a month ago, just by virtue of the fact that we've now got the government engaging on this subject again. We've got the withdrawal of the Consolidated advice note. So we are moving forward, and hopefully in the next couple of weeks we will have more information that we've assimilated with government and with other parties to understand what the scale of the problem is. But right now, right here and now, it's hard to put a date on it.
Okay. John, how about Ballymore?
As
remediation, yeah.
We started work on all of our buildings that require remediation. The vast majority of those we expect to complete over the next 6 months. There is a couple of projects that are more complex and will be impacted by the withdrawal of the advice notes. So we've started on the works we can start on. There are certain things that won't be affected one way or the other by the advice note withdrawal. So you know, again, when we provide the additional information in terms of that cost, we could also provide some information on timescales once we have the scope of the works settled.
Jordan, I mean, the evidence sessions we've heard here, and also sitting on the actual bill itself, resident voice was hugely important. And I just want to read out an email I received last night, which is about a building by Ballymore. I want to give her the opportunity to let her voice be listened to and hopefully get an answer from your good self. The BFSF mandated that all dangerous cladding had to be removed from the New Providence Wharf by the end of 2021, and Ballymore has done that. But we are now suffering very cold temperatures, neighbours unable to get bedrooms above 12 degrees even with heating, at a time when energy costs are soaring. Families trapped behind monoflex with no daylight, rubbish was kept in open bins in the streets, the scaffolding was blocked access to the refuse store, and now we are suffering security issues with unknown persons climbing the scaffolding, whether with ASB or criminal intent to break in. We have had to beg, plead and fight for information. Work has slowed down dramatically. We are getting no information. We know we are delayed, but we don't know by how long. In the meantime, we are stuck in our freezing flats with no access to sunlight due to the plastic sheeting or fresh air, due to the windows being sealed shut. I just wanted to give the opportunity for you to respond to that. And if you've got 20 buildings currently under remediation, is that a picture of what we're seeing across all 20, or is that an isolated incident?
I think that is an isolated incident at the moment. I mean, I think the reality is that during the remedial works and construction works, and anybody who's had construction work done to their home will know that it can be incredibly uncomfortable to work while these are significant construction works. I mean, I was made aware of some of these issues over the weekend, and to be honest about it, we are investigating. We haven't removed any insulation from New Providence Wharf. All the cladding has been removed, and the reason for the monoflex is we need to try and minimise the amount of moisture that gets into the facade. So unfortunately that's a necessity, and I do agree it's not ideal, people not being able to look out their window. So I think, and this will happen I think across, now in terms of the temperature, that shouldn't be happening. So that's something that we need to investigate and understand why that's the case, because the insulation has not been removed. So that's something for us to do. But I do think that across the industry it's something that people will realise that the impact of the works on people, because these works have to be done while they're living in these buildings, it is going to be uncomfortable. And I think the key thing is we need to try and get the works completed.
And I totally get that. But it's the lack of residents' voices getting heard, the fight for information. So there's obviously a breakdown somewhere, which I hope you do address.
Well, I think certainly in terms of the communication on these issues has been a huge challenge for our organisation. Of the 13,000 kind of homes we're looking after, I think about 25,000 residents. Since 2017, since Grenfell, the level of communication required, to be honest about it, has been extraordinary. I do accept at times it probably hasn't been as good as it could be. We have on New Providence Wharf, for example, we have a big team working on that. There's no excuse for not being able to communicate. So I think, but equally, I think it's about regular communication on a monthly basis where we can give people a proper update, because it's giving updates even on a day-to-day basis is just not possible when you're trying to deliver all these works. But listen, I take on the point on board, and we need to try and communicate as well as we can.
Absolutely, to keep people updated. You do, yeah. Okay, thanks for the answer. The second part I'll go back to David and I'll come back to you, John. How will remediation works be prioritised, and what priority will be given to provide disabled residents with personal evacuation plans?
I think the prioritisation question is one that we are grappling with and have been talking to government about since the very first days in the kind of immediate flurry of consultation that we had with the government in 2017. I think that's where we really need some support from the department, because within the next few weeks we would expect them to have a fairly comprehensive overview of the buildings that require remediation, and they will need to be prioritised, because as we talked about already, there is a general lack of qualified professionals, and there is a shortage of skills more generally as well. So we will be looking to government to help with that, I think, because there will be a situation where developers, and this is already happening really, and I'm sure John will attest to this, that everyone's really out there looking for the same type of skills all at the same time, when there are clearly will be gradients within the required remediation that suggest that prioritisation should be a priority. And as I say, I think it's not really for any individual builder to make that case, and it's not really for us.
Yeah. And the department. Okay, thanks. John, would you like to add anything to that?
I can only speak for ourselves. I mean, we want to get our buildings remediated as soon as we possibly can. We need to move on from this, and we need to. So we're fully aligned with leaseholders to try and get the works complete as soon as we possibly can.
Right, thanks. Peter, would you like to add anything? Peter?
Oh, sorry. I would just like to say that at the moment the sector is suffering from an insurance issue, and that is affecting the availability of experts and the availability of designers and quite a few other things across the sector. We've been talking to government for some time as an industry to try and sort out the insurance issue, but that adds to the problems that we're trying to overcome. Not trying to make an excuse, but that is part of the explanation of why delays are occurring.
I think we're talking to the insurers on on Wednesday. So we'll be able to follow those issues up with them. And just to say to John, yeah, obviously you've got a serious situation which Ian Byrne referred to in one of your blocks there. Would it be fair to ask you, but I'm going to ask you anyway, in 2 weeks, would this issue of proper contact and information to the residents there be resolved, and will the heating issues be resolved?
I will do everything I can to try and get those issues resolved.
And I think we'll be asking the residents to give a report to us, and I'm sure you wouldn't want to be coming back explaining why that hasn't happened. Okay?
Yep, that's fair, yep.
Right, okay. Right, on to the issue of contribution of manufacturers, which we briefly explored, but Andrew is going to go into in more detail. Andrew.
Thank you. So this is principally, Peter, to you, obviously. And the Secretary of State indeed wrote to you on the 22nd of January to say that the cladding and insulation sector also needed to contribute towards the costs of remediation, and said that the contributions, quotes, must represent a significant proportion of the total remediation costs, end quote. So do you agree that that indeed should be the case?
We certainly agree that we need to look into it and figure out exactly what the detail of that means. And since we had the letter from the Secretary of State, we've had a number of conversations with our members, and those will continue. And we want to work with the Secretary of State and his team to sort of really focus in on what that might mean in terms of a contribution. We will continue those discussions as quickly as we can, and we want to get to a point where we can see how that might move forward.
So the word, slightly tautologically, the word significant is significant there. So in order for you to be able to work that out, what assessments have you done of the contribution to the construction industry to cladding defects on buildings 11 to 18 metres and 18 metres plus? Have you been able to assess that?
No, we haven't, is a straight answer. The focus up until this new initiative has been largely on 18 metre plus buildings, and that has been part of the previous programme. And as we know, that work has been continuing. This is a new focus in terms of 11 to 18 metres. And as I say, we are keen to work through and figure out exactly how that can be defined. As I mentioned earlier, I think we do need to look at exactly the details behind each building, because we've all seen examples of potentially buildings being analysed perhaps not in quite an accurate way that they should be. So first of all, we need to, through the supply chain, identify exactly which buildings fit into this category, and then identify what exactly the remedial works consist of before we can get to an accurate figure.
Have you internally, or has the government, or indeed have your partners as developers and constructors given you any indication of what significant means? Because significant could be 5% or it could be 35%.
Absolutely. No, and that's one of the follow-up pieces of discussion that we need to have, and we will be having with the Secretary of State's team.
And what would be the impact on the industry if that significant portion was extremely significant?
It is challenging because we have a range of other factors that are affecting the sector right now. This is a subset of the overall construction products sector, and a significant amount might mean significant problems for some companies. There are a few large companies, agreed, but a lot of them are medium to small.
And would anyone in the sector want to make some sort of argument that excessive, or in your view, excessive contributions would prevent you investing in the future or investing in research and development to make products safer in the future?
Well, I would sincerely hope not, because we have a lot of work to do. As I set out in my letter to the Secretary of State, we've been investing as an organisation and as a sector a lot in the future, showing that we need to raise the bar, we need to increase quality, competence, performance. That to me is crucial for the future performance of buildings, but nonetheless we have to address the problems of the past. And so part of the sensitivity, if you like, of the discussions going forward is to make sure we can address the problems we see, but make sure that we do not hinder developments as we go forward. At the moment, there are a lot of factors that the sector has been working its way through, and I'm sure we probably don't want to go into all of those, but it's been a difficult couple of years. But we still recognise the problems that tenants and occupants have to put up with.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. So we've heard quite a bit about the discussions with government that are ongoing. We've read in the press what's happening, but now we've got a chance at first hand to explore with yourselves. Ben Everett.
Thank you, Clive. Let's start with you, John. How's it going?
Well, we had our first roundtable meeting with the Secretary of State a couple of weeks ago. There's a huge amount of information that has been requested of us, which we're busy pulling together, and the deadline is tonight. So our team are busy back in the office at the moment, trying to get that information back to the department. We had a follow-up meeting with the department last week, and they were looking for a reaction from us to the principles of the letter, which we kind of gave them verbally. And we're awaiting now this week, I believe, some feedback from the department in terms of kind of next steps. So from our perspective, that's where we see it at the moment.
You said earlier that you accepted in principle that something needs to be done. What would be a good result in your eyes in terms of the funding arrangements?
I think for me the key thing is that this needs to be something that's fair and proportionate and borne by all responsible parties, not just developers. I think right across the board, I think we should be looking to spread the burden, and I also think we need to look at the overall commitment, not just on one point, because I think if you look at what the developers are being asked, we're remediate. Most developers, and certainly we are, investing a huge amount in remediating our own buildings. We've a residential development tax, which is coming in now of about 4%. I mean, the one thing I would just say on that tax is that for developers like us, we're not big PLCs, we don't have the same balance sheet, and you're not allowed to offset your finance costs in terms of calculating the profit. So for companies like us, where our finance costs can be quite high on developments, we think that tax is probably going to cost us closer to 6%. On top of that, we've got the contribution that's been asked for, and there's also been consultation on a tall building levy. We tend to specialise in high density locations, so tall buildings is most of what we develop will fall into that category. So I think it's important that firstly it's fair and proportionate. I think also we need to look at all of those contributions, not just one, and look at what developers are doing. And also one other point I would just make is we as a business we work in both the UK and in Ireland, and I think just to give you an example, as we sit here today, if you look at corporation tax that we would pay on profits from residential development, it's 12.5% in Ireland and it's 19% in the UK today. The corporation tax in the UK is obviously moving up to 25%, and on top of that we think it's going to cost us about 6% for this residential development tax, and that ignores the tall building levy. So the taxation on high density residential development for us will probably be in around the early 30s. That's before the contribution, and that's before the tall building levy. So
am I to infer from what you're saying that your version of fair and proportionate is to also include all of the other taxes that you're facing as a developer in order to meet the total cost of remediation? Not that this new funding arrangement should cover the total cost of remediation, because that's, as you've described it, that's quite a delta.
Yeah, it has moved a lot, and I suppose as well, like for example, if developers have been asked to do the right thing. So if you have spent money on remedial works, I think it would be unfair if you're somehow you have to then pay the same tax. If you pay the same tax as everyone else, but you've put a lot more into remedial works, then that doesn't seem quite fair. So I think it's about trying to find a way that you can look at all of these taxes, levies, call them what you like, and or contributions, and that is spread in a fair and proportionate way, not just for developers, but also for material manufacturers. But
we'll come to Peter in a sec.
Yeah.
But so just to be clear, then, when you said you accepted the principle, were you accepting that the new funding arrangement should cover the total costs of remediation, or were you accepting that there should be some costs covered?
Yeah,
because that's a big difference based on the taxes and levies that you've just described there, which are significant. But that makes up a big difference between what you could be negotiating for in a funding arrangement and what it costs to sort the problem.
Yeah. Well, I suppose I actually don't know what that. I suppose my point is that I think if you look across all of these contributions, in whether you call them tax, levies, contributions, if you look at all of the funding that's going to be required from developers, I think that it needs to be looked at in the round, I suppose, rather than just maybe kind of focusing just on one element of it being the contribution. So that's what I suppose I mean by fair and proportional.
So you're going into these discussions with the Secretary of State on the basis that the Secretary of State needs to raise enough money to solve the problem.
Yeah, I mean, we don't speak for the industry. We'll do whatever we can to try and move these matters forward. So, but certainly in terms of what's been asked of us, we're hoping that we can meet an agreement, and we're certainly going to put our shoulder to the wheel to try and do that.
Thank you, John. So, Peter, over to you. Obviously, the wider point that the costs in reaching this funding arrangement should be shared across the sector, not just developers. Is that something you accept?
It is something that we're looking at, and something that we want to look at with the rest of the sector, yes. But I think the point is that we'd start from looking at a proportionate approach again. We'd also look at trying to identify precisely the costs for each building in terms of what is actually needed, and try and then work our way through with our membership and with others as to how this can be approached. But I think what I would say is that we met the Secretary of State last week, and we're now working on how that might actually be done. So for us, it's quite early days as to how we take this forward.
It's incredibly early days if we're going to do it bottom up, building by building, on a cost per building basis, where the target is to get the funding arrangement agreed by March. How's that going?
That is challenging, but we have been talking to our members, and we will continue to talk to our members and then do a follow-up with the Secretary of State's team. And we will hope to meet the deadline as set.
Thank you, Peter. John, just back to you on the March deadline. Is that something that you feel can be met?
If I'm honest, as I said, we'll engage as much as we can. I think it's by pulling the challenge here. I think is being able to pull the industry together. Yeah, everybody's got a different perspective. Everybody's got, and to do that within that time frame. But it might be, HBF might have a better view on how we do that. That's it's not something I have visibility on in terms of.
Hospital pass there, David. Go on.
Yeah, I'll take it. March is extremely challenging, and when I said at the start that what we're looking for is the sort of information that probably we should have had under our wing already. That is now being done at breakneck speed, as John says. The timelines involved are, frighteningly fast. But we're pulling all of that together because I think we do need to understand what the quantum is. We welcomed the Secretary of State writing to Peter. I think that was something that was overdue, probably. We've been around this block already on the residential property developer tax. As I say, we spent most of last year consulting with government on that, because at that point what they wanted from the industry was £2 billion, and here was a scheme, here was a new tax to to come and get it. And that wasn't universally popular, as you can imagine, with our members, especially those of whom have never built anything above a 3-storey house. And it reaches in quite far into the membership in terms of the size and scale of company. And this, judging from the press release put out by the department, this will reach down even further to many, many probably medium-sized companies in the region. So it's going to be, it's an extremely tough conversation that at the moment is only being had with, I think, John might correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the round table was attended by about 20 developers. We think this will probably have to involve about 50 or so, and those conversations aren't being
that's the crux of the problem, isn't it? In that we can only get this agreement if everybody cooperates, and we can definitely only get by March if everybody plays ball. What are your members saying in terms of their willingness to engage with this?
I think the engagement so far has been universal. There's no one has resisted the conversation. Indeed, they didn't resist the conversations being had last year when the government introduced the new tax. So we're going in with on a very constructive footing. And I think, going back to one of the previous questions, the flow of information, I don't want this to seem like the industry is slowing this down, because we have been asked for this information in the last week and we are providing it this week. And that flow of information is two ways. There are a number of members that we're aware of whose buildings or buildings that they had some involvement in building now sit in the Building Safety Fund, so are due for, in some cases, extensive amounts of public money. They've said to government that if those buildings can be identified, they will contribute to the remediation and do the right thing as they see it. We're not able to get hold of that information from government yet, and for various reasons we don't know when we will.
I'm aware we've got a selective audience here today of people that are playing ball because you turned up. There's the difference being, of course, is that there's the risk that not everybody does, and so we've had reports that developers who do not cooperate will be hit with restrictions using the planning system, supply of public land, taxation, and so on. And the Secretary of State has indicated that cladding and insulation manufacturers who don't cooperate will be hit with a trading ban. This is relatively tough talk. Is the government right to take this approach?
Ultimately, where we get to at the end of the process is up to government, and we don't really have a view on that for the time being, as we have done since June 2017. We're engaging on a very constructive basis and trying to help the government with what they need to achieve. So,
as an industry body, you don't have a view on the sanctions the government could take on the industry?
Well, I don't think we have a clear view, no. The Secretary of State outlined a few options, I think, in the letter to the industry on the 10th of January, all of which are under consideration and so on. But for the time being, we're just in the best possible faith engaging.
That's going to be the trick to getting there, is negotiating in good faith. So, fair play. John, any thoughts on that before I come to Peter with the specific point on the trading ban?
I mean, to be honest, the sanctions, it's not something we've particularly focused on. I mean, what we're trying to focus on is, is just to try and get these works completed as soon as possible. And I think if we can achieve that, that's our focus. So we haven't thought much about the sanctions.
Thank you. And Peter, over to you. It did seem like they're definitely talking about you there.
Yes, and we understand the Secretary of State means business, and clearly he's put that on the table to make sure that point is reinforced. We would like to think that we can rapidly work our way through this and get to a sensible solution without the recourse to something like that. But I think one of our problems, as I think I said at the beginning, is that not everybody who is in the crosshairs of the Secretary of State is part of our membership. And to some degree, we've got to rely on the Secretary of State's team to corral those companies into the same direction of discussion. But believe me, we will be working hard to see what we can achieve.
And I think that possibly just before I finish, Clive, that point you made there about having people in the industry that are not members of your membership can apply to David's industry as well. And so it is complex, huge, and very complicated negotiation.
Absolutely, and just to add to that, I think what we don't want to be in is in a position in a year's time where part of the industry, the UK-based home builders, are subject to a new tax, but international developers can come in from outside and not pay any new tax or not be subject to any sanctions. That doesn't feel like a fair outcome. And I think Peter's got the same issue. Large number of those companies are international firms. Again, putting the focus on the UK-based home builders doesn't seem entirely fair.
Thank you, David. I think we've got a good flag there. And
right.
Back over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Right, it's got two issues to just explore briefly before we get to 6 o'clock. Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies for late arrival, but there was something rather interesting going on in the chamber. And I just refer to my register of interest. So, very quick one. I'll start with David, and then if the others agree or disagree, just add in, but we'll try and be swift if we can, conscious of time. Do you agree with the government's decision to allow leaseholders to make claims under the Defective Premises Act for up to 30 years retrospectively?
We are still, at this time, trying to establish what the full impact will be on the industry. It's not something we actively opposed in any way, but I think there is a concern on the part of SME builders that this is a huge liability, a long-term liability. It far exceeds anything that is warrantable. So, as Peter's talked a bit about the insurance problems that the industry is facing, this doesn't seem like something that will be that easily overcome for those small firms. And the majority of our members are SME home builders, so that's something we're trying to establish the impact of at the moment. Yeah.
Thanks. Anything to add, John?
No, I mean, I think I agree with what David said. I mean, I think the only addition maybe is, it depends on what this would cover. Like, there are elements of buildings that will not have a design life of 30 years. If you look at, say, mechanical and electrical systems, for example, it'll be much more important in terms of how those systems are maintained during that 30-year period, and probably many of the components will have to be replaced during a 30-year period. So I think there's quite a bit of work to do in terms of thinking about how this would be implemented. And I do agree. I think I think if the liability would be taken on by developers, I think particularly small developers would need to find a way to try and pass that liability to people who make components of buildings. So I think in terms of how that risk would transfer, we would need to really think about.
Thanks, and I can see you nodding, Peter. I'm sure you want to add something.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think that with this, very much the devil's in the detail. I think the ambition is clearly there, but issues of maintenance, issues of design life, what was the original specification, were the components put together properly, and all of those issues need to be taken into account when you're considering something like this. But clearly, things that were defective from the beginning or incorrectly specified, they do need to be considered and definitely dealt with.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. Just from the final issue, when the Secretary of State made his statement, one of the key issues he made was about withdrawing the Consolidated Advice Note, issuing new guidance. And if I could just simplify it, it almost seemed to be saying, well, not as many buildings will now need attention, and the EWS 1 forms won't be necessary for very many of them, so life will be okay from now on, won't it? Just to come back first of all to David, is that your take on it, or do you think there are still issues to be addressed?
I think there are still some issues to be addressed with this withdrawal of the Consolidated Advice Note. Yes, it's very much welcomed, but again, we go back to the insurance issues and the fact that there is an indemnification scheme coming down the line. That won't be in place until, I think, Easter is the target from the government there, which obviously goes beyond any deadline that's been set for ongoing negotiations that we may be part of. But generally, I think the return to something approaching what the Secretary of State calls a common sense approach is positive, and it will have, hopefully have the impact that it needs. But it's vital that RICS, surveyors, lenders and everyone else is also part of that conversation. At the moment, it's not clear that they're responding in necessarily the
We're
way
talking
that
to RICS and the lenders on Wednesday as well. So, John.
Yeah, I mean, we welcome the withdrawal of the advice notes. I think, our view, for what it's worth, is that even though there are some details to be worked out, this will mean that a huge amount of work that would have been carried out that was probably unnecessary now won't be carried out, and we can use the funding that we have available where it's really needed. So we think that it's a very important step, and I think it could have a big impact on how we resolve these issues sooner.
Right. But I don't know whether either of you, and then I'll bring Peter as well if he wants to, saw the article in Inside Housing where a number of experts, including Dr. Jonathan Evans, who's been to give evidence to this committee, were essentially saying, well, you've still got the Fire Safety Act, you've still got to, for many buildings will need detailed fire risk assessments. It's down to the owner to decide which those buildings are, but most owners aren't qualified to do that. And they're taking risks, then they'll need those risks insuring. And those assessments could take a very long time, need to be repeated, and there simply aren't the experts around to do it. So this whole process, again, might simply get in a logjam and nothing happening. Is that a concern that's still around?
Well, from our portfolio, and again, I don't have the wider context, I think that it could have, and I kind of repeating a point from earlier on, but I think it could have a delay to the start of certain works. But I feel that the benefit of that could be that the works could be shorter, which means people are not living in a construction project for as long a time. And I think that, so I think in the round, I think it will mean that we get these buildings remediated sooner, is our view.
Right.
Yeah, I'd agree that I think that it's overall positive, but it's not a panacea in no way, and it will involve, proper engagement from the surveyors and from the lending industry.
But there aren't that number of surveyors around who can do fire risk assessments, are there?
No, and I think the government's announcement about indemnifying fire risk assessors is part of this. But again, we're waiting for that, and that's many weeks away as far as we're aware.
I think it is the issue around the discretion of the client. I think is something that should be looked at, because I think it does. In my mind, it should be either something that's applied or not. I think giving discretion, I'm not sure that's
who should decide then? If there isn't discretion, who should decide?
Well, I think if we feel that this new risk-based approach is correct, I think it should be applied across the board.
Yeah, but who decides on the risk?
Well, ultimately, it will be the regulators. I mean, in terms of this pass 9980. I mean, ultimately,
the regulator should decide which buildings should fall for necessary for these fire risk assessments to take place in them.
I think if we're going to rely on this standard, I think that we should say that this standard is sufficient and appropriate, or it's not. I think if we feel that it's...
So the regulator should lay down the standard and decide which buildings should be subject to these assessments.
I think that if the standard is acceptable, I think it should be acceptable to everyone. Is our view. Right. In other words, if the standard, because ultimately you're talking about safety, so there's no, you can't have levels of safety. The buildings need to be deemed safe, and I think.
Yeah, but it's back to this issue. But which buildings should be risk assessed?
All of them.
I think all buildings that are ultimately all buildings that have failed to achieve their EWS1 form to date, I think should be assessed. And in time, I think
it'll be a lot of work, isn't it, for somebody who doesn't exist at present because there aren't the numbers of inspectors.
Mm-hmm. I think the number of inspectors is a challenge. Absolutely.
Right. So Peter, I did say I'd bring you in. You were just nodding away there. Then we're going to have to conclude at that point.
Yeah, of course, Clive. Thank you. I just want to say I think the PAS is a step forward, but I think we do need to get more fire risk assessors qualified, and we do need a properly accurate, robust approach to this because it's so important, and it does need to cover all buildings.
Okay. right. Well, that's going to be a challenge in itself, but I think we can explore that further with other witnesses as well. But thank you to the three of you for coming to give evidence to the committee at short notice and for changing the times of your appearance at short notice as well. We very much appreciate that. Absolutely. And we appreciate that you've been willing to come to discuss these matters with us when others were perhaps otherwise engaged. What about that? Thank you very much indeed. That brings us on to our second panel for this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I think we have one witness with us in person and two on Zoom. So I'll just ask you all to introduce yourselves to begin with and just say who you are, and then we'll get on with our questions. First of all, Liam Spender.
Thank you, Chair. Liam Spender, representing the UK Cladding Action Group.
Thank you very much for coming. Ben Beadle.
Good evening, Chair. Ben Beadle, Chief Executive of the National Residential Landlords Association, representing about 100,000 private sector landlords across England and Wales.
And Andrew Bulmer.
And good evening, Chair. Andrew Bulmer, Chief Exec of the Institute of Residential Property Management, representing about 5,500 residential property managers.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for coming. Just to say, one or two members will probably have to leave part of the way through the session. That's nothing that you will be saying that will have deterred them in any way. It's just there are other events happening in Westminster today, and members are splitting their time between various meetings. First of all, over to Bob Blackman.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for all attending. And I'm just going to ask you first and foremost, obviously, the government have changed their position quite substantially on the 10th of January 2022 in relation to building safety, which I would first of all like to see what your members' reaction is to that change of heart. Can I start with you, Liam?
Yes, thank you. And may I say thank you to you, Chair, and to the committee, past and present, for all the work you've done on this issue. I don't think we'd be where we are today without that work in terms of keeping the pressure up on the government. So thank you, first of all. I think we're a long way forward. The key now is whether the government delivers on its promises. We need to see the amendments the Secretary of State mentioned in his announcement 2 weeks ago put down in the Lords, and we need to see the issues you were talking about with the three gentlemen before me resolved, and getting the contributions from industry, and then I think we'll know where we stand.
Okay, fine, thank you. So let's see, Andrew first. What's your reaction to the change of view? Thank you.
So we very much welcome the reset. We welcome the end of the proposed 18-metre, sub-18-metre loan scheme that was never going to work. We welcome the withdrawal of the Consolidated advice note and substitution thereof. And we welcome the £4 billion of funding and the hope of funding for non-cladding defects for buildings 11 to 18 metres. But we now really need to understand the detail. That's the positive, but we're fearful. We need to see how this is actually going to work. How will the 11 to 18 metre cladding fund actually work in practice? How will the non-cladding 11 to 18 metre fund work in practice, especially when there's no builder or warranty to chase? And what about cladding for buildings under 18 metres? We welcome the announcement on prioritisation of remediation. We have been calling for this. I've forgotten how long we've been calling for that. It's such a common sense thing. But on what basis and when and who will make the decision on how those are prioritised? And also with RMCs and residents and leaseholders taking on developers for the 30-year defects. Again, we want to understand how that is going to work. So it's a positive step in the right direction. In that sense, it's a breath of fresh air. But we're practical people and we really want to see how this will work.
Ben, your member's view.
Thank you, Bob. And yeah, to echo Andrew's sentiments, we are pleased with the announcement. The devil will be in the detail. I mean, we agree with the government's sentiments that innocent leaseholders should not be expected to foot the bill for the problem of dangerous cladding. Who would have thought we would have had to have fought so much to get to this point for a really basic view on life? But the problem is, for us, and particularly for our members, is that ministers have failed to confirm whether buy-to-let landlords will be covered by the scheme, despite being leaseholders like everybody else. These are people that typically own one flat in a block, not property tycoons. I accept that there may well need to be some exceptions for some very, very large developers that have built the blocks themselves and only have themselves to blame. But protecting leaseholders and making industry pay is an absolutely sound statement. So it's really disappointing to see that government have singled out a group of people for no good reason whatsoever.
So, just staying with you, Ben, who do you think should pay the remediating the historic defects on buildings, both cladding and non-cladding?
So, I mean,
pretty clear that leaseholders shouldn't pay, but who do you think should pay?
Well, I think what government have set out, that there needs to be an industry contribution in order to fund the remedials necessary, is a really sound approach. I just don't think you need to discriminate between certain groups of people that benefit from it and those that don't. At the end of the day, landlords are in the same bed as the average leaseholder. Unless they installed it themselves or built the block themselves, and they should be treated in exactly the same way as what the government have proposed. So we have a really narrow issue on this, Bob, to be honest with you, and that's that landlords should not be excluded from the provisions in the announcement on the 10th of January. It really is as simple as that.
Okay, Andrew, what's your view on who should pay?
Well, it should always come back to the polluter. That's the natural principle of justice. So that combination of developers, the industry, the construction industry, material suppliers and so forth. And government itself has put its hand in the pocket where government itself probably has some role to play in that. What is very clear is that leaseholders should not be paying. I would probably pick up on Ben's point about that, including the buy-to-let landlords. They are leaseholders also.
What happens, for example, when a company's gone out of business and they're no longer around? Who should pay under those circumstances? Andrew, sorry, I'm staying with you.
Thank you. So that's going to come back to government having a discussion with the industry. What is clear is that the leaseholder should not be paying. Somebody is going to have to pay, and ultimately that's either the industry or it is the state. As a taxpayer, I'm not a fan of the state paying. I'd rather not. But I accept my responsibilities as a taxpayer. The state has some culpability in this, but ultimately it comes down to who the polluter is. And if we can't identify the individual polluter because they don't exist anymore, then it is going to come down to some extent on that relationship between government and the industry, the construction industry, as how they sort that out between them. But it shouldn't be going back to leaseholders.
Okay. And what happens if the regulations, the building regulations, have changed subsequent to the actual buildings being developed? We now subsequent questions will go on to the change on Defective Premises Act, but we are in a position whereby some developers may quite rightly say, well, actually the regulation said this, and that's what we built, but it's now deemed unsafe.
And I have sympathy with that. I can understand the developer's point of view. I really can, but what should not be happening is the leaseholder should be paying.
Which we all accept, but then what's your view about who should pay? Because at the end of the day, your members end up managing most of these buildings, and potentially, of course, could end up contributing. Some people might say, well, you're managing these buildings, you should have spotted these things, you should have done something about it.
I think that would be a tricky call when the risk assessments are done, but generally by other professions. The property managers are not to blame for this crisis, nor are leaseholders, and neither of those two should be paying. I would be robust on that. I would suggest. When you have a state that is changing the rules, I'm going to leave that to the state to pay. As property managers, we just want to make sure we're managing state buildings, and the money's got to come from somewhere.
Okay. Coming back to you, Liam. Obviously, we're all in broad agreement about leaseholders not paying. What's your members' view on what should happen under these sets of circumstances that we just talked about?
I mean, I think the bottom line, which leaseholders everywhere are resolute on, is we're the end consumer. We bought in good faith. It's not our responsibility to clean up industry's mess, and it's not our responsibility to clean up regulators' mess either. I think in the most effective way of ensuring the burden doesn't fall on the taxpayer or the leaseholder or anyone else is to extract the contributions from industry, and whether that's through an expansion of the levy that's already in place, or whether it's through voluntary cash contributions, or whether it's through contributions in kind. I think we're agnostic on that. We have no strong view, but I don't think we should get into there are innocent industry players and there are not innocent industry players. They were all in the same industry. What's coming out of the Grenfell Tower inquiry is there was a high degree of knowledge within the industry about what was going on. So in our view, the ones who stayed silent are exactly as culpable as the ones who built shoddy buildings.
I'm not sure if you were here for the earlier evidence that was given, but from the witnesses we had, they said they don't know how many buildings were affected. We don't know what the cost of fixing any of these buildings is. And here we are, nearly 5 years on from Grenfell. What's the feeling of your members that are stuck in these properties who potentially are in unsafe buildings?
It's a fate you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. And the fact that it's gone on for 5 years is really a national disgrace. It should have been sorted out much sooner than now, than just the last couple of weeks, really. Although we have had half measures in the past, and the fact that the data isn't available and people don't know how big the problem is really indicative of the depth of failure so far. I mean, we are where we are. We need to get out of where we are. And
okay, all right. Thank you. Andrew, what do you want to see out of the financial arrangements that are apparently being negotiated with the industry?
I think we need a clear line to funding, and we need that funding to be delivered promptly. Beyond that, I'm relatively agnostic as to how the government and the industry arrives at their settlement. We just want to see the money.
Okay.
We just get these buildings fixed.
Ben, what do you want to see out of the financial settlement?
Well, I would just sort of echo the previous points that I think, this has been such a debilitating exercise, if I can say it, for those that are affected, that speed is really of the essence. I don't really want there to be a great deal of
clearly, you couldn't have seen the earlier evidence where we don't know how many buildings, we don't know what the cost is, we don't know.
Well, we need to get a grip of the problem. Stage. Well, I mean, but it's not like we've had a great deal. We've not had a great deal of time to get to the bottom of the issue, and I think we've got.
Sorry, with due respect, we have had a lot of time to discover what the extent of the problem is. The only dispute has been who's paying and who's carrying out the work. But
well, I mean, if I dial back to the Secretary of State's announcement, the Secretary of State's announcement was a very, very clear one. Yeah. And they should better get on and negotiate what the settlement is, because this is really affecting people in a desperate way, whether you're a landlord or not, and whether or not you will be able to access the remediation funding. It's an absolutely diabolical situation for those that are in it.
Okay, I think we've got a lot of detailed questions that we're going to go into now after that.
Thank you. Moving on to the cost for leaseholders, Florence Shillelagh.
Thank you, Chair, and again apologies for lateness, and I also refer members to my declaration of interest. Just sticking on to the issue around cost, I was also present in the Chamber on the 10th of January when the Secretary of State made that statement, but one of the things that came out loud and clear from members on all sides was around the fact that there are still concerns. Do you feel that the announcement protects leaseholders from all costs for making their buildings safe? Liam?
I think that remains to be seen. As you rightly say, there are some key details here that are missing or not fully explained, and we'd need to see those details and make sure they're resolving the situation for everybody, inside and out, so external walls and internal defects. And I think reluctant though leaseholders are to have to continue waiting, that is the only option we have at the moment, is we expect the department to deliver on what it's promised, and we expect it to do it quickly.
Andrew, from your perspective, do you feel that this protects leaseholders from all costs in making a building safe?
There are some significant gaps. I mean, if we were to generously assume that all costs for leaseholders in 11 to 18 metres were to be covered, that's both cladding and non-cladding, and I have my doubts. I do feel sceptical of the detail and where the end of that tail is. But it still hasn't addressed the question of non-cladding costs for above 18 metres. It still hasn't addressed the issue of buildings potentially under 11 metres that could be as a risk as well. So I want to be positive. We're trying to stay positive. We really need to see the detail.
One of the issues that I'm concerned about, and again, this will be similar to many other MPs up and down the country, is that I receive emails from constituents who are already paying. And one of the issues that my colleague who's left now, the member for Harrow East, raised with the Secretary of State was around people who've already started paying for costs. And the Secretary of State in that statement said that he can't guarantee and that the government will be able to compensate leaseholders who've already contributed the cost of the remediation. And we're talking about huge sums here. I receive emails with people paying in excess of £5,000 a month, money they don't have. What's your response to the fact that these people may not get that money back?
Are you addressing the question to me?
Yeah.
In that case, very simple. It's unjust. You have people who have been trying to do the right thing, often working with their team, their building manager, perhaps the landlord, whoever, but they've tried to do the right thing. And the right thing, of course, is to get the building safe as quickly as possible. To then be penalised for that at high level seems to be unjust. If the polluter is to pay, then it would suggest that if we are not to pursue the polluter for those where the leaseholders have already paid, then that's throwing those leaseholders under a bus, and I feel that would be unjust.
Liam,
I agree with the point you're making. Is that in some cases leaseholders are paying thousands of pounds each for these waking watches, for which there is no empirical evidence. They seem to be. The fire service says it's not its fault there are waking watches, but it says if the responsible person doesn't take steps, which include waking watches, then the building will have to be evacuated. And I think one of the disappointments we felt about the announcement is that wasn't addressed. When is someone going to take a grip of fire and rescue services? And they do a difficult job, don't get me wrong, but can someone not put to them that there is an enormous cost to this sort of intervention? Where is the empirical basis? Is there a better way of doing it? Those sorts of questions don't seem to be asked, and until the situation is resolved, people will have to continue paying, which is another reason why we need it sorted out as quickly as possible.
Ben, have your members been paying, and what kind of figures have you been seeing?
Well, thank you for bringing me in. We have one member with a leasehold flat in Manchester, a number of cladding and non-cladding issues that they've been asked to contribute to. The freeholder has already invoiced leaseholders for a share of the £7 million remediation costs, to the tune of about 65k per property, as well as seeking to spend 120k on an alarm system. These are things, I've got plenty of case studies that I will share with the committee. These are things that are already going on, notwithstanding the Secretary of State's announcement. So to echo Andrew's point, frankly, it doesn't matter if you've already started paying. The help needs to be there across the board, otherwise it is totally unjust.
Yeah, and the other thing that always comes up is the issue, and Liam's alluded to it, on waking watchers. So the additional 27 million to fund alarms to effectively end the use of waking watchers, and the Secretary of State announced that the government will work with insurance companies So again, these are all additional costs that leaseholders are having to pay now. How confident are you that ongoing costs for leaseholders, including wake and watches and insurance premiums, will reduce? Liam?
Thank you. I mean, that is one of the key issues we're missing. So we've seen in the last week the Secretary of State cajole the Financial Conduct Authority and the Competition of Markets Authority into asking the insurers these difficult questions. Why are prices so high? Why is there such a difference between a single block residence-run building's insurance cost and an institutional freeholder's insurance cost? That needs a lot of explanation. If the insurers are pricing buildings by risk, if they both have cladding on, the insurance cost should be the same, but they're actually wildly different. And until we have, and you were touching on it in the last panel, a coherent approach across lenders, surveyors, insurers, the government, managing agents, freeholders, as to which buildings actually need to be remediated, leaseholders will continue picking up the bill, and that has to stop, regardless of where we end up on who is paying for remediation. We can't keep treating leaseholders as the banker of last resort.
Andrew, I'm sure you've seen a number of those insurance premiums go up with some of your members.
We have seen some horrifying increases, and no property manager wants to be sending out massive bills knowing that the doing is just hurting the customer. We are really worried about this. Your exam question was, how confident are we? And I have difficulty answering that. We know that government has been talking to insurers for a long time. There have been many conversations, many promises. We have seen not much action as a result of it. So history would dent my confidence, but there seems to be a new mood, a new impetus. So again, we cross our fingers and remain hopeful, but my confidence score at the moment is at best average.
And just on that then, in terms of, we have been speaking about this, and I think many colleagues from across the House have always pointed that out. What concrete steps do you think that the government needs to, or guarantees the government needs to make progress on this area then?
If that question is to me, that's a very tricky one, because an insurer ultimately will decide their risk in isolation. They will decide what to do, and if they don't want to enter the market, then they don't have to. So there is an element of defensive pricing that's clearly going on, but it is a private sector industry. I think there is a role perhaps for a higher degree of state intervention in this one. Suggestions have been made, for example, about being an underwriter of last resort, which takes away the risk of a catastrophic loss, and that really ought to be bringing the premiums down. But none of these suggestions to date have gained traction, and we hope that they will.
And is there anything amongst your colleagues that you've been discussing to try and address and maybe help residential landlords in this?
Oh, I mean, it's worth me just sort of reiterating, I think, that as it stands, my members won't even benefit from the announcement that has been made on the 10th of January. So, the points that, yes, I've got lots of case studies of service charges tripling, quadrupling as a result of the costs of insurance and the difficulties in getting things insured. But as it stands, my lot don't even stand to gain from the announcement. So, we are very much the poor relation here, I'm afraid.
Yeah, just finally, Joe, do you, to all three of you, what do you think then, in terms of, again, discussing some of the funding, what do you think is the continued, what's the continued mission from the government in actually addressing this head on?
I think the fundamental problem, which is a large part of the reason, apart from shoddy construction, that we've ended up in the situation we find ourselves, is at the heart of leasehold is a conflict of interest. A landlord gets to spend someone else's money, the leaseholder's money, on these on the building, not a penny piece of their own money. And that's played out in buildings that have been put forward for remediation. You see the same issue. The assessor doesn't want to take the risk, the landlord doesn't want to take the risk, the leaseholders end up with the bill. And it's the same with the insurers. They know that the people they're actually addressing the invoice to aren't paying the bill. It's someone else's money. But one issue with insurance which hasn't been addressed is the reason, or part of the reason it's so expensive, is because it's loaded up with commissions for freeholders. And we need to do something about that to bring the price of insurance down as well. That can be 20% or more of the cost. And if you got rid of the commission, you'd immediately reduce the price by 20%.
Yeah, Andrew, you alluded to it earlier in terms of the fact that some leaseholders, bought the properties in good faith as well, and they don't actually have any involvement with the developers. What more do you think the government are missing out on in addressing this issue?
If we're still back on insurance and commissions and what have you, I would welcome transparency on insurance commissions. Okay. It is the customer at the end of the day that's paying those bills. But the risk point is a very, very compelling one. No professional is going to put their neck on the line and their PI on the line by taking a risk. Whether that's the insurer, whether that's the fire risk assessor. If you have a fire risk assessor or a fire service that is telling you to put a waking watch in, are you going to go against them and deny that on the basis that it'll probably be okay? Statistically, it may be, but by gosh, you're not going to. You can't do that. You can't do that. So the profiling of risk and the understanding of risk and the proportionality of risk is something that needs to be addressed, and certainly insurers are a large part of that conversation.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks, Lawrence. Moving on to the issue of shared owners, Andrew Lewis.
Thank you very much. The Secretary of State said the government will enable shared owners affected by the cladding crisis to move to more easily sublet their flats. How much of a difference will that make? Let's start with you, Liam.
Yes, I think it's a welcome step in the right direction. I think what the government's actually doing is loosening the guidance to housing associations and the like, because currently there's an express prohibition on subletting these properties, and they've also written to lenders and said they should give consent to let. So again, we're relying on actors other than the government to carry this through, but I think it is a very welcome intervention. The key is making sure it plays out on the ground.
Indeed. Ben, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with that, Andrew. I do think it's a step in the right direction, because what it allows is, it does allow people to move on with their lives. We've got examples of members who have gone on to sublet their shared ownership property and either purchase or rent another one, and that's essentially what it allows. If you can't sell it, then it's kind of the next best alternative to be able to cover some costs and to rent it out. But it's a little bit galling that we're going for certain subsects of the leasehold community that are allowed to do these things. But if you've but if you bought a property with the best of intentions because you are a buy-to-let landlord and rented it out, and you're in the same boat as everybody else, why on earth are the government singling that group of people out? It's just beyond me.
Thank you. And Andrew, same point to you.
Yeah, so shared ownership isn't really our bailiwick, but the proposal seems sensible. There seems to be little sense in locking people in. People are really struggling here and they need to be able to move on with their lives, and certainly from that point of view, it seems like a good thing. The only comment that I would make is that the Consumer Protection Regulations 2008 are now starting to move into letting agents. In terms of the cladding situation, guidance has been issued whereby letting agents do need to make prospective tenants aware of any material information that may affect their transactional decision. There's a question mark over what exactly information is required on that. So there's just a little cautionary note that even if the lettings are allowed, it may not be completely the panacea. We may find that tenants are making an informed choice as to whether they would want to move to that building that has problems or not.
Okay, well, just picking up on that then, and then I'll bring Ben and Liam onto it as well. But while you're on, Andrew, is there anything more therefore the government needs to do to help shared owners of flats with historic defects, given that you've just pointed out one potential continuing problem?
Well, that one would apply across the lettings piece as a whole. In terms of shared ownership, again, I'm going to say that this is not really our bailiwick. I am aware that there are issues where leaseholders may be bearing 100% of costs where they are not necessarily, where they don't have 100% of the ownership. And if that is the case, then I think that needs a look at as well. That seems unjust.
That's useful. Thank you. Ben?
Nothing further to add, Andrew. This isn't an area that we necessarily represent, so I'm happy to leave it to others.
Thank you. Liam, further thoughts?
I'd go much further than Andrew Bulmer. I think he was far too diplomatic. It's a travesty that shared owners with less than 100% being visited with 100% of the bill, and the government should most certainly make sure that's addressed in the final funding solution.
I'll pick that up. Thanks very much,
Okay.
Chairman.
Thanks, Andrew. We've heard a lot about the mental health pressures that come on people who are trapped in these properties. Rachel Hopkins, you want to explore this?
Yes, thanks, Chair. So the committee has called for improved mental health support in its report by those affected by the crisis back in April 2021, and it's something I've tried to raise with the Secretary of State and as the bill passed through committee, because having spoken both to constituents in Luton South and heard lots of testimony through the course of the bill, it's such an issue. So it's basically over the last 9 months, how has the support for leaseholders in the crisis, support for their mental health, has it improved at all?
I'd say no, it's not improved in the last 9 months. Leaseholders generally depend on each other for support. Last night a lady emailed me and said she'd been caught in the fire at New Providence Wharf, and she'd had no option but to wait on the balcony because the flat was smoke locked until the firefighters were able to come and bring her a smoke hood and a canister of oxygen. And I can't imagine what that must have been like. And she's had, she wrote and told me she'd had no support at all. And that's obviously an extreme example, but I mean, it's inhumane to keep people in the condition they've been kept in. Will you have a bill you can't pay? Will you not have a bill you can't pay? Can you pay the waking watch this month? Can you cover the insurance? And it's I think in a fair world, in a reasonable world, those would be costs for which leaseholders would be compensated. I'd hope that a reasonable government would be able to do something about that.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment?
Yes, I will actually. First of all, I'll endorse every word that Liam has just said there. I think that's absolutely spot on. But we have I could give you the same answer from a different perspective, which is that property managers are well aware of the suffering that leaseholders are going through. We work with and liaise with the cladding groups on a regular basis. We see the stresses and strains, but we see the stresses and strains also coming through our front line, which is our property managers on the ground. And when they are looking after deeply unhappy customers, often they are the messengers that get shot when they're sending the bills, when they're sending those waking watch bills, when they're having to report the insurance hikes, when they're having to say, well, it looks like you've got funding, but we still haven't got the funding through from the application. Good news, we've got money for the cladding, but we haven't got money for the non-cladding fire risk. So we'd still like another £25,000 from you. They are presenting huge, massive bills and delays to people who are suffering very greatly. And the consequence of that is that the relationship between the customer and the messenger can get very strained. Nobody wants to hear about property managers bleating because the conversation is all about leaseholders, and it should be all about leaseholders. They are the ones that are badly wronged here. But if I tell you that in a mental health survey of property managers, they are now in the bottom 17% of the UK population benchmarked against ONS survey on the Life is Worthwhile score, you can see that actually the whole system here is breaking down. There is stress and there is strain across the piece, and this crisis needs to come to an end, and it needs to come to an end fast.
Thank you, Andrew, for that other perspective. Appreciate that. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel. The government's proposed certain changes to the Defective Premises Act. To explore those, Mohammed Yassin.
Thank you, Chair. Do you welcome the government's decision to allow leaseholders to make claims under the Defective Premises Act for up to 30 years? You want to start?
Yes, happily. I mean, it's anything that that helps potentially resolve the problem and is another tool in the bag is welcome. Whether this actually will deliver results for many buildings, I think it's unlikely for reasons of practicality. One, you need someone to sue or worth suing. Two, after 30 years, are the documents you need to prove your case still going to be around? Are the people who worked on the building still going to be around to give evidence? And three, can you, as a group of leaseholders, organise and raise the money necessary, or find a lawyer to do it on a conditional fee agreement to actually access the claim? And I think in many cases the answer to one or more of those questions will be no, so it's of limited utility, but still welcome.
So do you think that it's not practical for leaseholders to bring claims under this Act?
Generally, it's not worth leaseholders getting involved in litigation, no.
Anybody else would like to come in?
I would support that. I think, again, Liam has articulated that well. I think the chances of your average RMC taking on a PLC developer with a QC that can simply outspend them is a challenge that I think is beyond the realm of all but the most resolved RMCs. And there is another issue, which is that it will then, in fact, we've already seen this. There's already one case going through at the moment where residents are suing their RMC because their RMC did start to take action, and there's a 7-figure sum in legal costs, and that's now being recovered through the service charge, and therefore the other residents are unhappy. So it is welcome. It is a good thing. It is another tool in the bag, as Liam says. But I think in practical terms, we're not going to have residents taking on the construction sector.
So what solution is there, if any, can be found for those who may not be helped by the extension to 30 years? Ben, would you like to come in?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, the question is that, the new Act allows the leaseholders to go back 30 years.
Yeah.
And if there's some leaseholders don't fall under that, or are not covered, or it's longer than 30 years, what's the solution for them?
Well, there aren't so many options available here. I think the system, I need to see a bit more of the detail about how the 30 years will actually work, because 30 years is a long period of time for the reasons that have been articulated, and it relies on the entity still being around and able to go after. So, I think it's a welcome move, but there are obviously some limitations as to how it will work in practice. Whether or not, and we spoke about this earlier, there could be some sort of fund from industry that is going to help those that either fall outside of it or where organisations are no longer about to pursue. That is something that could be considered.
Okay, you want to come in, or you agree?
Broadly, I agree. I mean, I think the ultimate solution is we need more money. If estimated costs are 15 billion and there's only 5 billion on the table, or 9 billion after the most recent announcements, we need to bridge the gap between the 15 and between the 9 and the 15, which is 6 billion. You won't be able to do that through litigation.
Thank you, Chair. Back to you.
Okay, move on now to the announcement by the Secretary of State about the withdrawal of the Consolidated Advice Note. Andrew Lure.
Thank you, Chair. So as just heard, the government has now withdrawn its Consolidated Advice Note. Do you welcome this move, and what's your view of the new document, PAS 9980, that's replaced it, Ben?
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, I think it is a good move broadly, and something to welcome. As I say, we approach this from a particular angle and a particular group in mind. So I'd be a liar if I said that landlords were jumping up and down with joy at this news. But I think it's certainly a step in the right direction. It's worth bearing in mind, I think, that the PAS 9980 is a very technical document, so I don't think you're going to get many landlords poring over it, but or many leaseholders poring over it. But I do think it's a step in the right direction, giving people clarity.
So Ben, just staying with you, staying with the technical as well, will this lead, do you believe, to fewer EWS1 forms being required?
Hopefully. I think that's what it's intended, but it will only replace the need if the industry interprets its methodology as being suitable to assuage the risk. So I think this remains to be seen. We have to see how it plays out.
Right, thank you. So Andrew, same question. Do you welcome the withdrawal of the Consolidated Advice Note and your view of PAS 9980 and your view on whether that will lead to fewer EWS ones?
We do welcome that move. We welcome a move towards proportionality. Whether it will deliver the promise of fewer EWS ones, I think, rests both with the insurance sector in terms of how we underwrite risk and with the lenders. Again, ultimately, it's up to them to decide whether they want to lend. They will make the argument also that they are protecting the interests of their consumers. Will they call for fewer EWS ones? I suspect probably a little, but it may not be the panacea we hope for.
It's interesting, if not that encouraging. Liam, same question to you. Do you welcome the withdrawal of Consolidated Advice Note, your view of PAS 9980, and your view on whether it will lead to fewer EWS ones?
Yes, so the death of the Consolidated Advice Notes, I don't think anyone regrets that passing into history. Misconceived intervention in the markets altogether greatly increased the scope of the problem. PAS 9980, I think I'm with Dr. Jonathan Evans, who you mentioned earlier in the last session, Chair. I think it tells you all the ways the building can potentially fail, but it doesn't give you the secret ingredient we need here, which is the objective definition of what is safe or what is acceptable, which buildings do need remediation, which buildings do not need remediation. And I come back to my theme about conflicts of interest. We won't reduce the number of EWS ones until we fix the conflicts of interest, until people can stop spending other people's money to cover their risks. And in some cases, like managing agents, make profits out of it because they generate project management fees from putting these buildings forward for remediation. So there's a perverse incentive in the system that needs to go as well.
And that potentially therefore lead to buildings that don't need work being prioritised over those that do. Yeah,
I agree. I think we're seeing a lot of that happening because there's no objective standard of risk. It's a free-for-all, a Wild West.
So just a general question to all three of you then, broadening that out a little bit. What else would you like to see the government do to help people to be able to sell their flats? I'll go round again, Ben. What else do we need to think about in order to move this on and help people to be able to sell their flats?
Well, from my perspective, Andrew, I want to, and sorry to sound like a broken record on this, but my interest here is making sure that all leaseholders can access the funding, because for my members, this is, we are excluded from the announcement that has been made, and our members do not want to be able to, do not want to have to sell their homes. They want to be able to remedy the things that have gone wrong as quickly as possible so that they can either move in or continue to let them. So my interest here is very, very narrow. And sorry if that doesn't answer your question, but we have to broaden it out to make sure that all leaseholders are covered by this announcement, this recent announcement.
Very good. Thank you. Andrew?
Certainty of funding, certainty of remediation, and a timeline will make properties far more transactable. I would leave it at certainty. to be honest with you.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Liam?
I endorse all the above, and leaseholders for the last 5 years have been stuck in the train tracks with the way the cladding scandal has played out. But there is a freight train coming towards them, which is the building safety bill. So we could find that leaseholders pull their feet out of the train tracks and then are hit by the building safety bill, which could continue to blight the property market for years to come for high-rise residential buildings.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Chairman.
Yeah, thanks. Just to follow up back with Liam, I mean, you heard the conversation we had with our previous witnesses, which unfortunately neither Ben nor Andrew heard, I think, about the replacement for the consolidated advice note. I think it was John Mulrain who said to us, well, really, the regulator ought to decide which buildings need to have fire risk assessments done, because currently the proposal is the owners should decide, but owners aren't qualified to decide, so we could get into another real problem there, where if the owner is making a decision they're not qualified for, then the insurers don't agree with that, or the lenders don't agree with it, we're going to get no further forward. So have you got any ideas about where responsibility should be put for deciding, which buildings are at risk and need this assessment doing?
I think the only way you do that is you give a central body the power to set the standard and make sure whoever's doing the inspection meets the standard. So the same way you'd mark an exam, and then you ensure consistency of decisions. So getting a regulator with teeth is part of the solution, and fixing the conflicts of interest I've been referring to during this evening's session is the other part of the solution.
Okay, so Ben or Andrew, any further comments? Yes, Andrew wants to come in.
Again, I would agree that it's a regulator. The regulator should set the standard and should set the methodology for making sure that those that are undertaking the risk assessments adhere to that standard. So that would make complete sense. While we're on the subject of conflicts of interest, I will also just mention another regulator should be the ROPA regulator. If we're going to have lots of money sluicing through managing agents' hands, we would very much endorse and support the statutory regulation of managing agents to make sure that any possible conflicts are well managed.
It's helpful. And Ben?
I would agree with everything that Andrew has said. For the sake of time, I won't repeat it.
Okay, that's helpful. Just finally, a nice easy question. Is there anything that wasn't in the Secretary of State's announcement that you would like to have seen?
I think the occupation phase of the building safety bill, so and Mr. Bulmer will be able to tell you what the Building Safety Alliance have been up to with building safety managers and building safety charges. That needs radical overhaul, otherwise high-rise flats will be blighted for years to come. So that needs to be looked at in detail in the Lords phase and resolved so the balance is redressed in leaseholders' favour.
Okay, so there's an in for you, Andrew, to follow on that.
We have concerns about the cost and the regime around the building safety manager. We have to make sure that buildings are managed safely, but that needs to be done in a proportionate way and at a reasonable cost. So we are interested very much in that concern.
Okay, and Ben.
Well, Clive, it won't surprise you to know that our view is that buy-to-let landlords are no more to blame for the cladding crisis than other types of leaseholders. Ministers have failed to provide any explanation why landlords should be treated differently from other leaseholders who are owner-occupiers. And really, the exclusion to this is pretty outrageous.
Okay. And you've been nothing if not consistent in that point, Ben, throughout that. Thank you all very much indeed for coming to give evidence to the committee. That's really helpful. Obviously, we're going to do quite a rapid session of hearings and followed by a report to try and affect where the government finally gets to with its amendments in the House of Lords and then back into the House of Commons. So thank you very much indeed, and we appreciate you altering your schedules to fit in with our different timing because of other events in the House today. Thank you very much indeed, and that brings us to the end of our public proceedings for today. Order, order.
Thank you. Has ended.